Every month, somewhere in the world, something happens that refuses to fit neatly into the categories most people use to make sense of human behavior. A crime that seems impossible until the evidence assembles itself. A disappearance with no clean explanation. A case that sits in the gap between what is known and what can be proven. June 2026 produced 5 of those stories, each of them strange in its own way, each carrying a particular kind of weight that the daily news cycle tends to flatten and move past before the full strangeness of it has had a chance to register. From the back roads of Hawaii's Big Island to a yacht anchored off the Bahamas coast, from a burned New Jersey mansion to the high-elevation forests of New Mexico, these are the cases that lingered well past their initial headlines and kept generating questions that the investigators still working them have not yet fully answered. Here is what happened, what is known, and what remains stubbornly unresolved. In the remote stretch of Lower Puna on Hawaii's Big Island, where the back roads cut through lava fields and dense vegetation, and the small communities that the landscape have a way of knowing each other's business, 36-year-old Jack Baker was a familiar and apparently unremarkable presence. He parked along the highway selling coconuts and fresh-caught fish, waved at the cars that passed, and had been part of the local scenery long enough that people knew his face and his name without thinking much about either. That familiarity makes what happened across roughly 26 hours at the end of May 2026 all the more disorienting to reconstruct, because the man people thought they knew turned out to be something entirely different from the picture the roadside stand had created. It started on the night of Monday, May 25th, when police were called to a property on Papaya Farms Road where someone had found a scene that was difficult to process. Bob Shine, 69 years old, was submerged in a rain catchment tank, the kind of water collection system that off-grid homes in that stretch of Puna depend on for fresh water. The initial assumption that it was a drowning did not survive the autopsy, which found no water in Shine's lungs at all. What the examination did find was that 6 of his ribs had been broken, his internal organs showed bruising consistent with severe blunt force trauma, and the marks on his neck indicated he had been strangled before his body was placed in the tank. Earlier that same day, a man who lived on Shine's property told detectives he had confronted Baker after watching him kick a dog, and that when he punched Baker in response, Baker kept repeating the same 3 words with the rhythm of someone who had already processed what he had done. Bob is dead. Bob is dead. The next morning, approximately 500 feet away, a second body turned up. Frederick Morse, 79 years old, known to everyone in the area by the name Cheetah, was found in his own bed. Blood was spattered across the headboard and across the walls surrounding him. He had been beaten severely about the head and face, and the fingers on his left hand had been cut off. On the wall and on the headboard around him, someone had written in pencil the letters LF and a phrase that translates to Holy Death. There was also a notebook near Bob Shine's sleeping area with the same letters on it, and at Shine's house, investigators found the full phrase written on the wall, a phrase that would gain additional significance within hours. Nearly 19 miles away on Kalapana-Kapoho Beach Road, the third victim had been found the same evening. John Carson, 69 years old and a retired insurance salesman, had allowed Baker to harvest coconuts from his land to sell. His tenant reported him missing. At the scene, police found blood, a single rubber slipper, a pair of eyeglasses, and a baseball cap that had been thrown into the brush. Carson's body was hidden under a sheet of corrugated roofing. His jaw was broken, his sternum shattered, and the artery and vein in his neck had been cut through with what the pathologist described as a double-edged blade. 3 men were dead across a span of roughly 26 hours and about 20 miles of back road in one of the most remote parts of the Big Island. A woman came forward with a critical piece of the picture. She told investigators she had driven Baker to a store in Hilo where he purchased a knife, brass knuckles, and a pair of sandals, paying cash for all of it. On the drive back, he showed her the blade and told her he intended to go after people on the island, describing his targets as predators and saying he wanted to chop them up with machetes. He then asked her to take him to a tattoo shop where he had words inked beneath his left eye, Lakitas, which translates loosely as the skinny girls. The same words had been written in pencil at 2 of the murder scenes. The connection between the tattoo and the scene writing was the kind of detail that tends to exist only in cases where the person responsible does not expect to need to hide what they have done. A multi-agency manhunt that included the FBI and U.S. Marshals swept through Lower Puna as Baker's face appeared on every available surface, and law enforcement described him as armed and extremely dangerous. For 3 days, the remote community locked its doors and waited. It ended on Thursday afternoon, May 28, when a couple checking security cameras on their vacant lot spotted footage of a man dropping flat to his stomach every time a car passed on the road above. Officers located Baker hiding in a small cave approximately 500 feet from John Carson's home. He came out without resistance and was arrested. He now faces charges of first-degree murder in Hawaii, a charge so rarely filed in the state that it is legally reserved for cases involving multiple victims and carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole. The second story from June 2026 began nearly a year before its most recent development, and its circumstances have generated a degree of public attention that its connection to a larger, stranger pattern of events has only amplified. On the morning of June 26, 2025, Melissa Casius, a 53-year-old administrative assistant at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, drove her husband to work at the facility, which sits in the mountains of northern New Mexico and carries a history that begins with the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. Casius realized she had left her entry badge at home, turned around, and decided to work from home in Rancho de Taos. She stopped at the post office. Around 1 in the afternoon, she dropped lunch off for her daughter Sierra, who was out shopping in Taos. A security camera captured her leaving, getting into her car, and driving away. That footage was the last clear image anyone recorded of Melissa Casius alive. When Sierra returned home that afternoon, her mother's car was in the driveway and everything inside the house that a person depends on was still there. Her purse, her wallet, her keys, and both of her phones, including her work phone. Some reports indicated that the data on both phones had been wiped before she walked out, factory reset to blank. At approximately 2:15 that afternoon, family friends spotted Casius roughly 3 miles from her home, walking alone on State Road 518, heading in the direction of the mountains. A nearby business camera captured the same sighting. Then nothing for nearly a year. On May 28, 2026, a hiker in the Carson National Forest came across human remains in a remote stretch of high-elevation terrain accessible from a single-lane dirt road called Rio Chaquito Road, reachable from the same Highway 518 where Casius had last been seen walking. Beside the remains lay a handgun. 2 days later, the New Mexico State Police confirmed that the remains were those of Melissa Casius. As of the making of this episode, the official cause and manner of death have not been released and the case remains open. The private investigator retained by the family, a former homicide detective named Thomas McNail, described remains that were fully skeletonized, positioned upright and seated against a tree, still dressed, with a gunshot wound to the skull. Those details come from the family's investigator and have not been confirmed by police. Casius's case attracted broader national attention partly because of its connection to a pattern that has prompted a congressional investigation. A series of scientists, researchers, and military figures with high-level security clearances who have died or disappeared in recent years under circumstances that have not been fully explained. 2 of Casius's own colleagues at Los Alamos disappeared in the same year she did. A retired Air Force general walked out of his home carrying only a handgun. The total number of cases swept into this broader concern has reached 11. But the family's own investigator offered a direct rebuttal to that framing, stating that Casius's death had nothing to do with her work at the lab and that she should never have been grouped with the others. What drove Melissa Casius to leave everything behind and walk toward the mountains on a June afternoon in 2025 remains, as of this writing, genuinely unknown. Until the medical examiner's findings are released, all that exists is that last camera image. A woman alone on a highway, walking toward the tree line, with no one who can say why. The third case carries a particular institutional weight because of the specific sequence of decisions that preceded it. In the fall of 2020, Oregon was burning. More than 1 million acres of the state were consumed by wildfires, and among the crews sent to fight those fires were inmates from Oregon's prison system, people serving time for serious crimes who were given tools and sent to stand between the flames and people's homes. One of them was Jesse Calhoun, whose criminal history included burglary, car theft, and assaulting a police officer. For his service on the fire lines, Calhoun was among approximately 40 inmates whose sentences were commuted by Governor Kate Brown in 2021, and he walked out of prison roughly a year earlier than his original sentence required. Within 2 years of his release, 6 women were dead in the woods surrounding Portland. Kristen Smith, 22, was last seen in December 2022, though investigators would later allege she had been killed weeks earlier around November 20th. Then came Charity Perry, 24, Bridget Webster, 31, Joanna Speaks, 32, and Ashley Reel, 22. Their bodies turned up between February and May of 2023, scattered across a sprawling radius of roughly 100 miles stretching from northwestern Oregon into southwestern Washington. Some were found in isolated wooded areas. One was discovered in a culvert. Another was found beside a road in the middle of empty countryside. Joanna Speaks was found near an abandoned barn across the state line. These were not women who had simply been left where they fell. They had been carried to the edges of the map and placed there. Some details about how they died have not been publicly released, but in Joanna Speaks' case the record shows she died of blunt force trauma to the head and neck and was beaten to death inside that empty barn. In June 2023, Portland police publicly stated there was no reason to believe the cases were connected. Behind that statement, a multi-agency investigation spanning 2 states and involving the FBI was drawing connections that all pointed in the same direction. When investigators moved on Jesse Calhoun and a SWAT team arrived to arrest him, he fought back, kicking at officers and attempting to choke the police canine, before being taken into custody. A grand jury indicted him for 3 of the murders in 2024. A 4th count followed in 2025. On June 3, 2026, he was arraigned on a 5th count of murder for the death of Ashley Reel. In court, Calhoun showed no reaction as his attorney entered a not guilty plea. He now faces 5 counts of second-degree murder and 4 counts of abuse of a corpse. The 4th case is the oldest of the 5, reaching back to a November morning in 2018, but its courtroom conclusion arrived in 2026 and brought a closure of a kind that the victims of that morning had been waiting for across more than 7 years. On November 20, 2018, 2 days before Thanksgiving, a doctor in the wealthy New Jersey township of Colts Neck looked toward his neighbor's mansion on Willowbrook Road and saw smoke rising from the property. He assumed leaves were being burned and tried to call with a warning about potential fines before the reality of what was actually happening became clear. A landscaper working on the grounds made the first discovery. Keith Canero, 55 years old and a successful businessman, was lying face down on the front lawn. He had been shot 4 times in the head and once in the back, his hooded sweatshirt pulled over him with a bullet hole punched through the fabric. Inside the burning house, firefighters found Keith's wife Jennifer, 45, and their 2 children, Jesse, 11, and Sophia, 8. None of them had died in the fire. All 3 had been stabbed extensively before the house was set alight. Jennifer had also been shot in the head. The fire had burned her severely. Both children had fought back in their final moments. Forensic testimony presented at trial years later described little Sophia suffering 17 stab wounds, including 1 to her eye, and appearing in her final seconds to be attempting to dodge the blade coming toward her. Her brother Jesse, weighing 95 pounds, had thrown his arm across his chest trying to deflect the knife as it went through him. The fire was meant to erase what had been done inside that house. It did not get rid of everything. That same morning, a few towns away in Ocean Township, a second house belonging to Keith's older brother Paul was also burning. Paul's wife and children escaped alive. When a fire marshal asked Paul how the fire started, he said he had no idea. But the pattern of 2 fires in the same family on the same morning, one household massacred and another left alive, drew immediate attention. The second fire, investigators quickly realized, was not an attack on Paul's family. It was Paul's own attempt to appear to be a victim and direct suspicion elsewhere. Keith and Paul Canero were not only brothers but